they drew some inspiration from science fiction. Not necessarily literal inspiration, just because science fiction writers don't have to get it right. You know, just we'll hand wave, and we'll invoke unobtainium or something like that. We don't have to get it right, but you know, if we create some big images that inspire people, then we've done our job.
Well, I think it's great you brought up Blood Music. Have any of you read Greg Bear's Blood Music? It came out in 1984. It's no coincidence that Eric Drexler's Engines of Creation came out 2 years later. Drexler already had his ideas, but it seems directly related. I'm not going to say there's a cause and effect, but there is at least a temporal relationship between them. That this thing was sort of in the air. People were talking about nanotechnology around that time. And so that, I think, brings my position on the entire thing, because I was educated as a deconstructionist, so I'm a fan of Jean Baudrillard, who writes about science fiction and simulacra, and he says that the dichotomy between science and science fiction basically is false. That you can't even point to either one as causing, affecting, that there's just a complete interplay between them. So even if you read any sort of technology writing, modern science writing, popular science writing, and not the stuff of journals, you will often see the first lines, this is the stuff of science fiction. It's just repeated over and over that some new development in technology or science is the stuff of science fiction. It becomes a meaningless distinction. No, it's not the stuff of science fiction anymore, because it's real. So to say it tells me that this distinction just doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying that there's not there is a difference between the real and the imagined, but the two have an amazing interplay.
Speaking as a sometime science writer, just by putting the hook at the start of an article, this is like science fiction, activates a lot of imagery on the part of the readers. You know, there's this, now in society, there is a whole trove of images and you know, fiction, TV, movies, NASA, who knows what. But as soon as you know, click on this is science fiction icon, in everybody's mind it activates a whole lot of good imagery that a writer can use, you know, writing about this cool science thing. And you know, you can misuse it, but you can also use it to really engage the reader's imagination, even on some science that's pretty, oh my God, this is dense. But it's something that science fiction writers call the edges of the idea. If you describe the edges of any idea in such a way that it really catches the imagination, the reader is going to be with you. It's a very valuable thing to do in science fiction or science writing. The interplay. Let me mention an episode from ancient history. I've had a lot of stories appear in Analog Science Fiction magazine. In its previous incarnation as Astounding, it goes back about 80 years. In the very early days, John Campbell was the editor of Astounding, which later became Analog. He was very much concerned to get the science right. If I'm not mistaken, he was a physicist himself. If at least he cultivated physicists, you know, assiduously. There came a time when the science community was kind of buzzing with, you know, there's something on our horizon, and that would be the atomic bomb. But the scientists and people following science kind of knew that this was in the offing. Campbell apparently turned the screws on one of his writers and said, okay, I want you to write a story about this thing is going to be the atom bomb. And, you know, here's some papers. There were papers floating around, technical sources, and Campbell said, we can do this. He knew kind of what would happen, and he hoped to have it happen. What happened was the FBI, after it was published, swooped down on the offices because they wanted to know, you know, how a science fiction magazine had leaked the imminent atom bomb. It leaked it because the editor was keeping his ear to the ground and had a right to write the story. He was enormously pleased to have attracted the FBI into the scene. But that's, in analog astounding for many years, there was a really tight interplay, to the extent that Stanley Schmidt has done that, who's now the editor of Panelists. As space developments come up, you know, he's had people, hey, go look into this. And he's also, one time at a convention, Stan was saying, when discoveries were coming in the solar system, one after the other, there was more than one story where he had to send it back to the writer. Look, the Voyager pictures just came out. You're going to have to change this. And the writer goes, sends it back. So a very tight connection between science fiction and the dissemination of scientific ideas and images.
That sort of reminds me of a story about Larry Niven. That his first published story was, it hinged on the fact that the coldest place in the solar system was the dark side of Mercury. So, you know, he wrote this in like late 1964 or something like that. Between when he sold it and when it was published, people did radar imaging and discovered Mercury rotates as a 3-2 resonance with the sun instead of a 1-1 tidal lock. So, he wrote, I think Frederick Pohl was the editor of the magazine he sold it to. So he wrote him a letter saying, hey, I got it wrong. You know, do I need to send you the check back? You know, and the editor, you know, Fred Pohl's editorial style was less hardcore than Stan's or John Campbell's. That, you know, those things happen. It's not, you know, the concern is not getting the details right, just getting the feel of the future.
That sort of ties into a question I was going to ask about scientific accuracy in science fiction, is that you talked a lot about how important scientific accuracy is, but then there's the, is it more important to get the science right or to get the vision of the future, or perhaps the story, what we can say about people, and so how, where do you think kind of accuracy ranks in terms of how important it is to the story you're telling, I guess?
Can I quote something that John Kramer said? John Kramer is a PhD graduate of Rice. He wrote the book Twister, science fiction. He now is a physics professor in Seattle, University of Washington, I don't say the school is. Twister was a book. It had a lot of pretty hardcore physics. But on the panel, one time, John Kramer was saying, okay, when you put science in science fiction, there's an art to it. He said, you don't just think of anything and cram it in. He said, you have to accept the body of the scientific knowns as what they are. Then, he said, you find a place to cleverly graft on something that nobody knows yet. So his school wouldn't have been just fling anything in there. It's like, ponder what's already known, what's already written and thought. Find a great little, you know, blurred place to graft on something as wild as you want to make it.
Well, the idea of grafting on, does that mean that it's, because one of the definitions of science fiction is that it's based on this thing called the novum. There's this kernel of new development, new technology that the entire story is based around. So it's that the science fact, and even analog, isn't it still science fiction and fact?
That's the title.
The subtitle, yeah. The two go together. That there's the kernel of fact that the entire science fiction story is written around. So is the idea that Kramer is talking about, is it just to give the story a sense of plausibility, a sense of accuracy, or does it drive?
It drives.
It does.
And